I want to discuss tonight is the really the view of Yetziat Mitzrayim as a historical event and the significance of recognizing it as an actual historical event, and the challenges this presents within the consciousness of our mind today, which leads us to a recognition of what we are really supposed to be thinking about in terms of Pesach, in terms of Yetziat Mitzrayim. I want to begin with the challenge of modern history, of our study of history, of secular study of history, in terms of Yetziat Mitzrayim. There was a conservative rabbi in Los Angeles, one of the rabbis in the major conservative synagogues in Los Angeles, who came up with a statement a few years back. He made in a sermon that he presented to his congregation, I think even right on Pesach, said he has to represent that there is no historical documentation or argument for the Exodus, especially not the way that is presented in the Chumash, in the Torah. And it got into a lot of hot water in his congregation. People were very upset. And it was basically denying the whole Pesach story. The fact is that really is the position of the modern study of history. The Exodus is not perceived to have any evidence outside of the Chumash text, and that leads to the argument in secular history that the Exodus did not occur, which is the position of basically Reform Judaism and basically the vast majority of conservative Judaism. That the story of the Exodus is a myth. That's the viewpoint. What this rabbi encountered was a remarkable populist reaction to it, and he encountered it in his conservative synagogue, and you also will find it in other conservative synagogues and Reform synagogues, that telling Jews that the Exodus is a myth gets Jews of all stripes very, very upset. The challenge is that it's really very difficult for Reform Judaism to maintain its theological principles in maintaining that the Exodus actually did occur. And the same with some aspects of conservative Judaism, and you get into real theological issues, that if you support the presentation of classical Judaism on the Exodus story and in terms of Sinai and so forth, you start having challenges in terms of the belief structure of Reform Judaism, and Reform Judaism is very much supported by the lack of miraculous understanding of the Exodus. That's why within the clergy of Reform Judaism or conservative Judaism, there is the argument for the historical truth of the historical perception the Exodus was a myth. Okay, but they usually don't really openly share it with their congregants, because, or if they share it, they get some reaction to it, because they understand that the theology of Reform and Conservative Judaism is really built upon the lack of the veracity of the biblical text. Orthodoxy, which argues for the truth of the biblical text, obviously has an argument. Obviously accepts the fact that there was an Exodus. The challenge to orthodoxy becomes the fact of why isn't it that you have any other historical documentation to support it, and that becomes an issue within orthodoxy. Why isn't there any other support that's found? This has led to some people, such as Simcha Yakubovich, to come up with in his movie of Exodus Decoded, to present some arguments that there is actual evidence for the Exodus. And he's argued that there is some indications in some Egyptian papyrus that does point to the Exodus. He argues some other archaeological arguments for the pointing of the Exodus. The fact is, though, is that his arguments are not generally accepted by most historical scholars, but at least he believes he has some arguments. The thing is that the arguments, that there is some arguments for the Exodus, was actually presented by someone earlier in the 20th century by the name of Emanuel Velikovsky. Does that name sound familiar to anyone?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
He wrote Seam's book.
Yeah. So Emanuel Velikovsky was he wrote Worlds in Collision.
Oh yeah.
Emanuel Velikovsky was a pretty radical thinker, and he came up with an argument that there is arguments for the Exodus, and he was actually explained how the Exodus occurred through natural phenomena by believing that there were changes in the orbits of Mars and Venus and so forth, that this led to the plagues. He also argued that there was, since what happened in Venus and Mars that caused the shift that led to the plagues, he says he actually tries to bring down that there's actually indications in texts throughout the world, ancient texts throughout the world, that there were some events like the darkening of the sky or the water turning red and so forth and so forth. But he obviously didn't argue that they were miracles from God. The argument is simply Yakubovich. But the thing about Velikovsky is he said he found some Egyptian papyrus that he believes was a recording of the Exodus of that time. Most Egyptologists say that's wrong, that this papyrus is not a recording of the Exodus, has nothing to do with the Exodus and so forth. And Velikovsky argued that the reason they don't want to see it as part of the Exodus is because of their dating of the papyrus. Okay, since they dated the papyrus in such a way, I think earlier than the Exodus, they don't want to tie it to the Exodus, and therefore there's a whole issue. Therefore he thinks Egyptologists, by dating it that day, they're not considering the fact that it did show the Exodus. And his argument is that the dating, who says they're right with their dating? And he argues that Egyptology, being a closed investigation, they're not subject to critical analysis and so forth. Anyways, that's back and forth. Simcha Yakubovich had similar arguments. In his argument, he also tried to show how the Exodus did occur. He also showed natural reasons for the Exodus, and he then also tended to argue that there was some archaeological argument for the Exodus, which again most Egyptologists reject. But the problem is that, Velikovsky did it for other reasons. Velikovsky was not Orthodox, and he had no interest in improving the actual Exodus. He just wanted to say that he actually was just arguing that the 10 plagues might have occurred, and his idea could be that if there was such a commotion in the world, it's possible that slaves could have left Egypt. Simcha Yakubovich seems to argue that there are natural reasons for how the plagues could have occurred, and he argues that there's some archaeological evidence and so forth. Thing is that you still have questions. I mean, the truth is, you read about the Exodus, and you read how the Exodus was understood, and so forth and so forth. There's a major event in the world, and there's very little documentation. Of greater significance, and this is what this rabbi in Los Angeles was basically arguing, is that there's limited archaeological evidence. The Exodus as presented in the Chumash is of 3 million people leaving Egypt and then traveling through the desert for 40 years. How come we have no archaeological discoveries for their existence in the desert for 40 years? Okay, especially a population of 3 million. So there's an issue of what happened. So therefore they sit there and say, listen, if you have 3 million people traveling in the desert, you expect to have some kind of proof for this, and there's no archaeological discoveries that seem to support the Jews traveling through the desert. The challenge with that, though, is the fact that we're not exactly sure where the Jews traveled. We all talk about the Sinai Desert. There's a lot of argument that it wasn't the Sinai Desert, it was actually the Arabian Desert in which they traveled. And that Mount Sinai was not what we define Mount Sinai today in the Sinai Desert, but it was actually a mountain in the Arabian Desert. And there are people who argue that because we don't really know where they moved and so forth and so forth. At the same point in time, the problem is okay, so how come we haven't found anything wherever? Arabian Desert, Sinai Desert, and so forth. The fact is, though, is that I was told by someone who was very much into biblical criticism and so forth, he said there's one problem the Egyptologists do have. No one knows where the Jews came from, and there's no evidence of the Jews showing up until they actually conquered Canaan. And he says that presents a tremendous problem to ancient historians. And I remember when I studied a little bit of ancient history back in high school many years ago and so forth and so forth, it was always interesting about how the story of the Hebrews always began when they were already in Canaan. Okay, and there was no mention of this group of this nation conquering Canaan. There is therefore an argument that the Hebrews were actually indigenous to Canaan, and therefore, but the fact is the Hebrews always talked about the fact that they entered Canaan and they conquered it. Okay, that's the way we have it in Yeshua and so forth. We conquered Canaan. So where do we get that story from? But there's no archaeological problem. The problem is there's no archaeological evidence that. The problem is they do have arguments to show the Hebrews being in Canaan, the Hebrews even potentially conquering Canaan, but where would a force so strong have developed to be able to conquer Canaan? Pitom, suddenly we have the Hebrews in Canaan with them saying that they conquered it, so where'd you come from? And how did you come with the strength to conquer this nation? So this person involved in biblical criticism said that's a classical problem of Egyptology, of where did the Jews come from. Obviously, the Chumash answer says this is the answer. That's is an argument where they came from and so forth. But what's interesting is, and this is what I really want to get to, is the fact there is no archaeological evidence for the Jews traveling in the desert is really not a problem if you think about how the Jews did travel. And you have to then recognize what it is that you really believe in in the argument of the Exodus. See, Simcha presents an argument that seems to say, I can explain the plagues in Egypt through natural means. There was a volcano went up and so forth and so on. Velikovsky comes up with an idea that that there was Earth's, that there was a change in the orbits of the Earth. What people do not recognize, though, and I'm not arguing the truth of this now, I'm arguing what it is that Orthodox Judaism believes in. Orthodox Judaism does not believe in an exodus per se. Does not believe in slaves just going free. It believes that an exodus occurred that was totally miraculous and defied the rules of nature. And that was a very significant aspect to what we believe in terms of the Exodus. It's not just simply that there was an Exodus. The belief of Orthodox Judaism is the fact that it was an event that defied the rules of nature. And that really leads into a very significant understanding of what it is that has occurred with history or has occurred with religion. The fact is that if you believe that nature has not changed over time, then it is impossible to believe in Orthodox Judaism. It's interesting. I once had a discussion with Michael Kegel from Passages, from the old TV show Passages, and he pointed out to me that Greek philosophy. Michael was a PhD in philosophy. He said Greek philosophy is built upon the concept of the lack of change, the lack of movement. If you read the Greek philosophers, permanence is the number one value. Therefore, the ideal God or the perfect God cannot even know details, can only know absolutes, because perfection is tied in absolutes. And therefore, reality does not change. Reality is totally consistent. Therefore, and that's the basis of all science. The basis of all science is that reality has maintained the same. So therefore you ask the question, where did this come from, where did that come from, so forth, so on, evolutional. That all works with the fact that I'm looking at the world today, I project back into history and saying the rules of the world are always the same. Therefore, where did these things come from? Which is really the basis of thought, of any type of thought. The thing is, and Greek philosophy and science and so forth and so forth, the thing is what Orthodox Judaism argues is that things don't have to be the same. That things can change. And the very concept of the Exodus is that God is above nature and can do whatever He wants to nature. And that really was the aspect of that really was the belief of the Exodus. That's what Moshe says to Pharaoh. Something's going to happen that you can't explain. They have no way of explaining. Now, the fact is that yields a very different understanding of the history of the event. Like, for example, and this is not an argument to say I'm going to prove it, not prove it. I'm not arguing. I'm trying to say what exactly is the argument. For example, how did the Jews travel in the desert for 40 years? How did they travel? Okay, but what did they have? Give me some of the aspects of how they traveled that was not in line with the way other people travel.
Manna from heaven.
Manna from heaven. Right? They ate miraculous food. What else?
Moving wells.
Moving wells. They had a well that moved around with them. They had, what?
The clouds.
The clouds. The clouds totally protected them.
And the pillars.
What? And the pillar of fire at night. The fact is, what people don't recognize is that when you talk about archaeology and try to say the society was there, the two most well-known, or the two things that usually you find in archaeological discoveries, which actually show that people were there, was usually kitchens and lavatories. Right? You needed a place of garbage and refuse, and you needed a place for where you made food, and usually, and a lot of times they were tied to the refuse places. So if you look at a lot of discoveries archaeology, it usually is in the garbage dumps. It's usually in the how they made food. Okay, now what were the garbage dumps when the Jews traveled miraculously in the desert?
Well, there would be one, because if it was manna, it was just enough for them to sustain, and there wouldn't be.
The fact is, manna had no refuse.
Yeah.
Okay, the Jews on manna did not go to the bathroom. Okay, manna was not prepared in the kitchen. What?
For 40 years.
Right. Manna was not prepared in the kitchen. Right. So the fact is this.
Tofu wafu.
It's not tofu. Okay. What?
Agreed, it's not tofu, but tofu wafu. They feed it, they baked it,
But
not in the kitchen.
My understanding is they just ate it, but the fact is it wasn't really. It was okay. You're right. They do some baking, but the fact is you're right. But the fact is, you're right. I got the impression that they ate it much more. Okay, you're right. You're right. But the fact is, for sure, it wasn't refuse. The point is that really points to archaeology. You had the Anani HaKavod around them. Okay?
And the clothes didn't.
The clothes also did
so
not.
Nothing to leave behind.
Right. The clothes also didn't do laundry because their clothes was not effective. So the point is that really points to is what you're called upon to believe with the Exodus is really a miraculous event, which is defined by 3 million people orderly leaving Egypt, right, and then traveling through a desert. Now, the fact is that leads to other questions. Like what always hits me, what always hit me is the fact that when the Jews did show up in Canaan, okay, why did the Canaanites, go to war with them? Okay, I mean, we're told that Rahab, who was the woman who hid the 2 spies that Yeshua sent, says to the spies, "We all know what you did. You wiped out Egypt. You lived for 40 years in the desert. This happens, and so forth and so forth. We all know how you existed." Okay. Now, given that to be, read the story as you read it. If you read the story, the question must exist: why did the Canaanites then go to war? The Canaanites were warned by Yeshua. You have 3 choices: pack it, get out of the country, abide by from the I'm just thinking about that tofu thing. I mean, because it came from you, I'm thinking she's bringing up tofu. I'm sorry. The fact is that the Canaanites were given a choice: get out of the country. We're going to abide by the Noahide code, and we'll let you stay, and you'll be okay. Or we're going to wipe you out. Now, this nation is living through these miracles and so forth, and all these things and so forth are happening to them, and they're just traveling for years, and they just beat up Egypt. You're wondering, like, hey, mister, what kind of person goes to war? Now, the truth is I saw this recently in Maimonides. Maimonides talks about how there are certain occasions where God will take away your free choice. Okay, one of the most classic one is by Pharaoh. Okay, that God took away Pharaoh's free choice. The Rambam gives another example. He says that the Canaanites, before they went to war, God took away their free choice. Now that gives an answer why they didn't why they even went to war, because they look kind of stupid. I mean, we all talk about Amalek attacking the Jews, and the reason it's perceived to be so evil is because it was totally ludicrous. But the fact is what most people don't recognize is that when you're talking about the Exodus, when you're talking about Yetzias Mitzrayim, you're talking about an event that is incomprehensible from our perspective. You're talking about an event that worked within different rules. That's what the religion presents. Now, obviously, okay, if you don't believe in the religion and so forth and so forth, you're going to have difficulties, arguing the Exodus and so forth and so forth. But whatever you argue in terms of the Exodus, it's not the Exodus is portrayed by the religion, because the fact is what the religion is arguing is for an absolutely supernatural event that basically makes the following statement: that reality changes, that there are shifts in reality. There's a period of time where there were miracles, and there's a period of time there weren't miracles. And that whatever that means, there was a period of time where God was more directly involved in the world, and not so. I mean, the fact is that in many ways, and I've said this before, we don't even understand how the people lived within that world. At the same point in time, if I'm arguing miracles, then why is it that anyone was practicing idolatry? If there were miracles happening, then how is it possible for people not to believe in God? And it leads to questions. So what exactly is free choice? And I pointed out this before, that when you read about Jezebel, right, that you have a case where Eliyahu Navi does this remarkable miracle on Har Carmel. Achab, Jezebel's husband, is there, sees this miracle, has no doubt that what occurred was from God, because what happens is that the altar is totally submerged in water, totally wet, and so forth. So Eliyahu basically says to God, "Light my fire," and the fire comes down from heaven, and all of a sudden there's this great miracle, and then all the people say, "Hashem hu Elokim," God is God, Hashem is God, which is what is said in Yom Kippur. And then when Achab goes back and tells this story to Jezebel, Jezebel sends a messenger to Eliyahu saying, within 24 hours I'm going to kill you. Right? He said, because Eliyahu killed all the priests of Baal, of the idolatrous god. So Jezebel writes back to him and says, what happened to all my people is what's going to happen to you tomorrow. And you're looking at this and say, hey lady, do you not get the message? It's totally out. So the truth is from a classical Jewish perspective, and looking at the Bible, you're talking about something that is outside of our ability to understand. It's just incomprehensible. The Exodus is incomprehensible. Pharaoh saying, "Hey, we're not going to let the people go," is incomprehensible. The Egyptians running after the Jews is incomprehensible. And the truth is, there you can start getting answers that, well, that's why God took away their free choice and so forth. But the whole events of what's occurring over here is stories that do not fit into our rational world today, our reason today. And this leads to a very significant aspect of what we're called upon to believe in.
But if we're told that part of the mitzvah is to recreate, or to feel as if we're re-experiencing this, how can we do that if you're saying that it's not possible?
That's one of the things I wanted to get to, is the fact that what does that idea mean? That we're supposed to feel that we've all left Egypt, we're supposed to feel the Exodus, but the point is the event that we're talking about is totally incomprehensible to us.
But and also, I wanted to ask you, isn't there something about any time something happens and we perceive it, we may have a moment where we feel that's miraculous, but ultimately I think we try to, it explains itself almost to us, because we have to live with it. It becomes part of our story.
Right, so therefore what happens is many times we are describing it from our perspective, or we try to incorporate it into our frame of reference. And our frame of reference is not with miracles. the idea of what Simcha tried to do, Simcha Gad tried to do, and so forth, is understandable. We're trying to get some comprehension of this. We're trying to work with this. The fact is that as we consider certain aspects of what happens in the world, the truth is we have to deal with it with our world today. And that exactly leads into the thing with which we're raising in terms of Egypt, in terms of the Exodus. The fact that I'm projecting into the world, or projecting the idea that there was a miraculous time in history, and that the call of, let's say, of Orthodox Judaism is to believe that there was a miraculous time in history, in many ways, what I'm actually saying is the analogy or the comparison is Abbott and Costello. Who's on first? What's on second? I don't know. Who's on third? The point is that when who is it? When who is it? Costello says, okay, I pick up the ball. I throw it to who? Who throws it to what? What throws it? I don't know. Triple play. And he says, yeah, you got it right. He says, I don't know what I'm talking about. The fact is that's very much part of what we are encountering here. The point is when we talk about events in history, and this is something that I think applies to our whole study of the Chumash. When I hear someone come up to me and say, okay, let's understand God saying to Avram to sacrifice Yitzchak. How would you respond if God told you to sacrifice your son? How would you respond?
What, are you kidding?
Right? Okay. There was a Saturday Night Live skit about that. Okay, God, I'm about to do it. God, what are you telling me no? So the fact of the matter is that they understand. Other people say, if God told you to do it, of course, it's God telling you to do it, but still, it's your son. Fact of the matter is that my most important point, I'm saying, if God spoke to you and said, take your son, I said, okay, maybe you'd want it, maybe for the first thing that happened, since you just soiled your pants, maybe you'd want to get changed, because if God spoke to you, I think you'd be, and then how would you know it's God? And the fact of the matter is what you're talking about is Avram, who already had conversations with God, being told to do this. So the point is that when you start talking leaps of faith and things like that, it's like I look at it and say, wait a second, you have no comprehension of what that is. So then the question is, so how do I relate to it? Given the fact that I'm talking about a chasm of reality between the reality today and the reality there.
So how do you answer?
Yeah.
If to 2/3 of the Jewish population, let's say, this is simply a ritual.
Yeah.
Then why do they follow this ritual? There's hundreds of other rituals.
Yeah. The fact is that why people have chosen that. I remember I once did a program in Yom Kippur.
It's a pretty lousy one to choose.
I once,
if you're going to maintain any semblance.
I once said to a group on Yom Kippur of people who were fasting Yom Kippur, I said, if you want to pick a ritual, if you don't believe in this, you want to pick a ritual, why don't you show up for Purim? Come on, that's a good one, or Simchas Torah. What are you all coming on Yom Kippur for? The fact is, it has a lot to do with perceptions of religion. Has a lot to do with perceptions of religion. The reason that a lot of people have a misunderstanding of Judaism is because their understanding is colored by Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur being the most significant days. Now, for example, the idea of the synagogue. People think that, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they're the most synagogue-focused holidays, therefore they got to be the real special ones. And the truth of the matter is that who says the synagogue is really is really such a... I don't want to make it seem like it's not an important place, but the fact of the matter is Judaism is not synagogue-based or synagogue-centered the same way lahavdil Christianity would be church-centered. The point is, yeah.
You've mentioned 3 or 4 times already the words of incomprehensibility.
Right.
One cannot. Are you suggesting that mankind is not in a position to ever comprehend? Is this something that has been designed that we should not be able to comprehend? This relates to Harvey's.
Right. So the point is when I say incomprehensibility, I'm actually presenting a challenge. I'm presenting a challenge. Human beings have to comprehend. The fact of the matter is our nature to try and comprehend.
So you're suggesting it is comprehensible?
Well, it's comprehensible for us, given the nature of it. Let me give you an example. Someone asked me a question about sacrifices, animal sacrifices, right? It's clear in the Bible that it was a significant aspect of Judaism, animal sacrifice, right? It states in the Rambam, notwithstanding what the Rambam says in the Moreh Nevuchim, he states in Yad HaChazakah that the belief in Messiah will be the reestablishment of animal sacrifices in the temple. So when people talk in Israel about rebuilding the third temple, they're talking about with animal sacrifices. People have asked, say, can I comprehend animal sacrifices? The fact is, from my perspective, animal sacrifices seem totally ludicrous. Okay? The Rambam's viewpoint on animal sacrifices is one that I would find more in line with my thinking. And the idea that we don't have sacrifices today is more in line with what I would call an advancement. That seems to be an argument between Maimonides and Nachmanides, between Rambam and Ramban, where the Rambam basically argues that the absence of sacrifices was a movement forward of human beings, that we no longer needed this ritual. And the Ramban, Nachmanides, basically attacks him very powerfully on that. And the truth is Maimonides' argument does run into some problems. The point is, though, is that when I'm asked questions of what I think about animal sacrifices, I basically say, listen, I've never experienced it. I have no experiential knowledge of animal sacrifice. I especially don't have any knowledge of what happened in the Beis Hamikdash, so I have no idea of what you're really talking about. So the point is, so what I'm saying, that's an example that if someone asks me what I think about animal sacrifices, the truth is I don't have all the information. The truth is, therefore I have to deal with it from my perspective. Yeah.
Two questions.
Yeah.
They're interrelated. What is the relationship? We start out with historical event.
Right.
What is the relationship, from your perspective, of comprehensibility in historical event? And secondly, what is the relationship of comprehensibility and truth?
Okay. So the fact is, yes, and the fact is I'm also getting back to my wife's question before about how we can understand that we are that we are supposed to feel that we left Egypt. What I'm really presenting, though, when I use the word incomprehensibility, is the fact that we as human beings have to try and understand as best we can. What I'm doing here, though, is I'm presenting the challenge of the event. And I think a lot has to do with the challenge of God. To me, when people ask about believe in God, do you believe in God? Do you have proofs for belief in God? And so forth and so forth. The number one aspect of belief in God is what I would call the incomprehensibility. Okay? What you believe in is the existence of an entity that you have no idea what you're talking about. That perhaps is the most powerful statement about God. And you think about this. You can think about this in terms of infinity. You can think about this in terms of a lot of concepts that we have. When people ask aspects, like for example, when you ask a question, about cause and effect and the first cause, and well, who created the world? Well, God is the answer. Everyone thinks that's a brilliant answer. That the craziness of atheism is that okay? So where did this world come from? You have no cause, therefore the classic answer is you need a creator. Okay, and that's the first cause and so forth. Okay, so now comes the next question. So who created God? So what are you really postulating when you state that you believe in God. What you're postulating is the existence of an entity that defies the rules of cause and effect. What you're stating is that in this world there's cause and effect. I can't understand where things came from, where this world came from, because everything in this world has a cause leading to an effect. So therefore, where did life come from, where these come, are all questions within this realm. And that if you're an atheist, you're basically saying somehow in this realm, which seems to have these principles of cause and effect, something happened, but you don't really have an answer to it. What you're basically postulating with the existence of God is the existence of another realm, a being that does not exist within these rules. At that point in time, you're obviously also arguing for a being that you cannot really comprehend. So in many, many ways, that's the challenge of religion. And one of the reasons that I find existing within a Jewish perspective is the fact that within Judaism, you basically always, from my perspective, are aware that when it gets to a certain point, you really don't know what you're talking about.
So then why did God ever make himself present?
So the point is you have to try, and the idea is that there is some challenge that we are to face in terms of this type of movement of trying to be able to comprehend God. I mean, the fact is that Rabbi Tern, the Nishma's senior scholar, once pointed this out to me. He says the Rambam is very adamant that you can never know God. The Rambam also says that the first mitzvah and the prime mitzvah is to try and know God. So basically, the Rambam basically says that your goal in life is to do something that's impossible. The whole objective of human beings is trying to understand God, and I'm telling you right now, you can't. The fact is that within Judaism, it's not the comprehension of everything at the end. There is steps that take you along the line to make you a little bit more closer to some value of comprehension. But the point is one of the things that always gets me upset is when I hear people make statements, like you make a statement, he's going to hell. The person, what? You're God? You know justice? You know things work. So the truth is that when you hear statements about good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people, and so forth and so forth, those are where you encounter the limitations of your own ability to understand, because you don't understand. And the fact is that in many ways we are trying to comprehend the human experience as much as we can, but we have to understand it with a certain limitation. And that limitation is that ultimately we don't really understand the source of existence from a Torah perspective, which is God. Now this leads into some things that I read about Yetzias Mitzrayim. Fact is that I was reading some statements from Rabbi Soloveitchik, and also some statements from Rabbi Shimshon Hirsch about Egypt, about the Exodus of Egypt, and the miraculous nature of the Exodus from Egypt, and why that's significant. And what Rabbi Hirsch seems to point out in terms of his understanding of Yetzias Mitzrayim is the encounter of God to the human being, basically being an encounter that is, what's the word I'm looking for? That's an encounter that is the human being having some type of relationship with God, qua God, out of his incomprehensibility. So we were taken out of Egypt in some manner that was a total act of godliness. And that is a significant perspective from Rabbi Hirsch, in the sense that it is basically establishes a certain relationship with God. Rabbi Soloveitchik points out something different. He tries to argue that even in that relationship with God, the Jews had to do something. They had to put the blood on their doorposts and their door, you know, at the what do you call the
Lintel on the door.
lintel doorposts. Okay, thank you. The fact is it shows that you still have to do something. The fact is that in certain ways, what I believe happens with Yetziat Mitzrayim and Har Sinai is the necessity of the human being encountering a reality that has an aspect of incomprehensibility in it. Not incomprehensibility in terms of saying it's illogical, but the fact is at the same time the human being is still called upon to try and comprehend to the extent that he or she can. And that's a dilemma that's constantly found within Jewish thought. At the same time that we are told that God is incomprehensible, logic is given a tremendous amount of value within Jewish thought. Okay, the fact is, as far as the idea of a logical conclusion is given tremendous thought within Judaism. In many ways, you would think out of an incomprehensible aspect of God, you would think in terms of, let's say, Christian concepts of belief being absurd. The fact is that at the same time that we do confront the fact that we don't really understand God, we're also told to try and comprehend Him as much as we can, and we're also told to try and comprehend this world as much as we can, even though God, as the creator of this world, has put within it some aspects of incomprehensibility. So the point is that there's a dilemma there in the sense that the Jew is called upon to try and gain as much knowledge as possible, while still understanding that there is a chasm at the end. We don't really know what's happening. Now this, to me, is significant in looking at Yetziat Mitzrayim as the opening statement of Jewish existence. It's pointed out, I think it's both pointed out by Rabbi Hirsch and by Rabbi Soloveitchik. It's very, very interesting that we came out of slavery, and that our starting point as a nation, I think Rabbi Soloveitchik is the one who actually makes a statement that our starting point as a nation is really at a point of the absolute lack of nationality. We were slaves. We were non-entities in the realm of Egypt. We were totally lacking any status, and that's the starting point of our existence. It's not the same way as since then we were told to take steps for further movement and so forth and so forth. He points this out, that from that originating point where we're being taken care of God, and Rabbi Soloveitchik says this other ways. Like, for example, he argues in terms of miracles. He says the absence of miracles was an indication that we're moving beyond the childhood years of our nationhood. So Rabbi Soloveitchik points out that you look at a child. When a child's a little baby and children, the parent has to do much more in terms of taking care of the child. When the child is an adult or an adolescent, the parent has to step back and say, okay, you have to have your own space. So he compares that to the age of miracles and non-age of miracles, which is somewhat of a radical idea, where he basically says it could be supported by Maimonides, has challenges from Nachmanides' views of miracles, but he basically, Rabbi Soloveitchik, developed the argument that when God was doing miracles, he was basically saying, listen, you're still kids, I'll take care of you. But eventually you got to do it yourself. You have to go in there and do it yourself. So Rabbi Soloveitchik says that the resettlement of Israel by Ezra, which was done much more through settlement rather than a conquest that was really tied to miraculous achievements, was a much more permanent settlement because human beings had to get involved. But the fact is, when you ask in terms of look, the point is that what we're called upon in terms of our workings as Jews is that we encounter at Yetziat Mitzrayim, we are called upon to encounter a reality that challenges our ability to understand it.
But isn't that specifically necessary in order for a human being to have a relationship with God? Isn't it unique, completely unique to God?
But the fact, yes, but the fact is that's where you go from there, because then there is the idea of trying to comprehend whatever you can, and therefore there's a comprehension of the world. That actually leads, let's say, for example, the viewpoint of Chaim Volozhiner, okay, in Nefesh Chaim, is the reason that view of Judaism focused upon the law is that basically it was an attitude that says you really can't comprehend God. All you can really comprehend is God's will in this world. Therefore, when you try and study the law, what you're trying to understand is how God wants man to behave in this world. Because there's an aspect of that being that you are in the process of trying to understand what you can using thought. In other words, what you're left with is that there's this chasm, there's the idea that you're left on one side with the ultimate reality being incomprehensible. On the other hand, you are left with the fact that you are supposed to try and move towards it. In terms of slavery from Egypt, in terms of your question, you're left with the fact that you are supposed to go through that transformation. So the truth is, in a certain way, this might be the way Rabbi Soloveitchik would understand it, is that when we move from slavery to freedom, we're moving from the recognition that there's an incomprehensibility to existence. We have our realm of lack of knowledge, or a realm of inabilities, or a realm of stuff, and we are trying to take steps to move to try and do whatever we can do. A free man can move them.
The struggle between logic, like I hate the word blind faith. I don't want to
say that it's blind faith, because it's not that aspect of faith.
It's an active leap of faith, though.
Well, I don't want to use the idea of faith.
Why not?
The fact is, because faith has connotations of it not being a logical conclusion. What you're faced with is, when you argue a creator, the argument of let's say, the argument of a God, okay, is you basically saying that when you postulate the idea that, what I would say is that the atheist and the theist are both left with a dilemma. The atheist is left with a dilemma that I can't comprehend this reality because I can't explain where anything came from, in a reality that says that there's always a cause. Okay? So what you had, when you had philosophers arguing the argument for creation, that wasn't a faith argument. That was an argument that said, hey, this reality does not have a cause, cannot exist without a cause. Therefore, I'm going to postulate that there's a theory of an existence of something that doesn't have a necessity of a cause, which is what you're saying, is that God is the first cause, or you're postulating a theory of something that doesn't live within this, it does not have the parameters of this reality. Now, accepting that alternative rather than not accepting it, you have no proof of it, so therefore it's why do you decide to accept that possibility or not? That's an issue. If you want to call faith the acceptance of that possibility, where it's a certain idea when you're given two different possibilities, which one you're going to choose, you go on faith or intuition, okay, I can understand that term for that. But the postulating of an idea that there is an entity that is not bound by these rules, right? That already is a logical possibility, which is what the philosophers all argued. So that's why. But the fact is that then you're dealt with. Okay, so how do you deal with it? What I don't like is the fact that or what I'm arguing from Judaism is that what we find is that even though we have the postulating of a reality, that is incomprehensible, we are still given the task to try and comprehend whatever we can comprehend. And in many ways, that is tied to Yetziat Mitzrayim. Okay, because in Yetziat Mitzrayim, when you talk about the Exodus, when you talk about leaving slavery and the total absence of any ability to do anything, or any value of self, the slave does not have a power of self. He does not have a self-identity. So when you talk in terms of freedom, what you're saying is, I exist. I have some type of value. At that point in time, there is the movement from the state of total incomprehensibility to say, I'm going to do something. So applying to Rabbi Soloveitchik's idea, where he said the Jews did something to be involved in the Exodus, that was a statement of, I have value. And that's really what's happening with the comprehension of Mitzrayim, and coming out of a realm that really is fully articulated in terms of its miraculous nature. And that's really the challenge, I think, that we find in terms of Pesach. We encounter again the fact that the challenge of existence is finding our self-identity in the realm of godliness, which is an identity that is incomprehensible to us.
So if you say I can only have a relationship with God if I know myself, but any knowledge I have of myself has to include the idea that God is not completely accessible to me.
Yeah.
So if that's the definition, then it's no longer inaccessible. So the inaccessibility becomes part of
the fact is that in many ways it's constantly a dynamic system. In other words, one of the things about Judaism is it is extremely dynamic because it's constantly throwing out the dialectic. Rabbi Soloveitchik once pointed out, Rabbi Soloveitchik again, he once pointed out that the distinction between the Jewish view of thesis and antithesis and the Hegelian view of thesis and antithesis is that Hegel believed there's thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. He argued that Judaism maintained, I'm not saying always, but Judaism maintained the acceptance of thesis and antithesis without necessarily finding a synthesis. So he said in many ways...
Can you slow down and explain that?
Okay.
Because it sounds like he's on first.
Okay, so what
Which
Rabbi...
one of his lectures did he give out?
I read it in an article in Tradition where he argues, where he makes this distinction about it. Let me explain what I mean. He said this is a theory. By the way, this idea is found in many ideas.
Yes, in his book on repentance, he talks about that.
Right. But the fact is, he presents, for example, that in terms of Purim, it's not just the dynamic nature of the way he expresses things is that there always has to be coexistence of opposites. So he says on Purim you expect to have a fast day beforehand, because he says that even in this joyous occasion there's always has to be a little bit of the sadness of reality. And then he turns it around and says in terms of Tisha B'Av, which is the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, is also referred to as a Moed, which is holiday. And he says that on Tisha B'Av there are certain aspects of the day which actually seem to imply some aspect of celebration in this overwhelming sadness. But he constantly points out that there's a dynamic nature of our relationships, and what he says in terms of thesis and antithesis is that Hegelian concepts was that there was a thesis, some concept, and then you say it's always good to help to give to. Let me try and give you. It's always good to pay your debts. Let's give an example. So then you have Socrates' argument. Wait a second. What happens if you're holding out to someone's some bad guy's rifle, and if you give him back the rifle, he he's going to shoot people, is it good to give him back the rifle? So the point is to say it's always good to return lost articles. Well, here would be an exception. That's an issue in ethics. You have a value, and then you have the development of the other value, and then you come to some kind of intermediate level. So I'm trying to think about this in terms like Marx would argue that you had the capitalism was a response to feudalism, right? And then communism is a response to capitalism. But what happens is that you start throwing out a value. Let's say, I'm trying to think of a good example. See, already in my mind, we're already thinking that you have a value that says
Charity.
yeah, charity is a value, and then you have antithesis. And this is a good example. Welfare is a value. We should make sure that no one is able to. No one should starve. No one should starve. So then you get the reaction to that basically says this is just going to allow people. And you have the people arguing that this kind of welfare argument allows people just to become slouches, and all they want to do is say, you take care of me, and they're not willing to work anymore. So you have the thesis that no one should starve. You have the antithesis that says, no, only people who work should eat, because otherwise and then you come up with some kind of synthesis where you come up with some way of trying to create a system which doesn't encourage people basically not slouching, but
charity becomes something that helps people.
Right. Okay. So that's an example of the Hegelian movement, and that example will exist from the Jewish perspective also, where not everything is synthesis.
But can that work in a slave mentality of Israel leaving Egypt and spending?
Well, that's where you have movement and dynamics over time. But the fact is that if you look in terms of what the Rav is arguing, he's basically arguing that there's a thesis and antithesis. He's arguing that we have to maintain in our head opposites at the same time. So, for example, when you think in terms of concepts of din and chesed, on one side you are empathetic to a person. On the other side, to chesed and so forth and so on. On the other side, din says that the person has to accept some kind of responsibility. And how do you coexist of these two concepts at the same time? Okay. The fact is that trying to live in a world where you talk about having logic and trying to comprehend at the same time of recognizing that God is incomprehensible is a challenge. It's a challenge of what we talk about. You talk in terms of very wise men. You have wise men say, that Socrates used to say, I'm wise because I really don't know anything. The fact of the matter is that if you talk to big Talmidei Chachamim, right? If you talk in terms of the lessons of Judaism, it's like there's a value of knowledge, there's a value of knowing things, and so at the same point in time, you recognize you really don't know anything, because when you think in terms of God, it's always exponentially beyond you. So the point is you deal with these issues. Yeah.
So I understand with the the issue of whether there's a God and so on, certain incomprehension whether someone's an atheist or a theist.
Mm-hmm.
But how does it relate to, let's say, the Exodus from Egypt? So let's say the Torah says they're plagues, and we'll just deal with the killing of the firstborn. So either it sort of happened historically or it didn't.
Yeah,
it's sort of like saying that Germany invaded France in 1871.
Right. The fact is that's what I think is significant. From an Orthodox perspective, you believe that this event occurred.
So it's dependent upon your worldview.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying it's part of what your worldview is. Right. It's part of what your worldview is. The fact is that you're right. I'm not going to argue I'm arguing that if you I guess what I'm saying is that Orthodox Judaism it postulates that this event happened, but by postulating this event happened, it's significant in terms of coloring all of reality, and
It determines historicity.
Historicity even today.
Yeah.
In other words, even as I look at the world of reason today, which has no miracles, the fact is that I talk about an event in history that was found with miracles. In other words, so therefore, it changes my perspective of the reality around me, which makes it, which I think yields a certain dynamic reality. In other words, and it was interesting because this is one of the aspects that I was talking about with Dr. Kegel at that time. That the fact is from a Greek perspective, you have a certain view of reality, and that reality is very, very, very. What do you call it? Is defined very.
It's both structured and narrow.
Very
Right,
finite.
very finite. From a general religious perspective, if you especially if you get into the mystics and so forth, it's like almost anything goes. It's like and so forth. The fact of the matter is you're talking about a completely different perspective, and there's no parameters on logic. I point out to people, for example, that if you talk about let's say prophecy, okay, you go to certain people talking about prophecy. The Jewish idea that prophets had to be chachamim, had to be wise before they became prophets. Like I've said that to people, and say, why? If God's speaking to the person, why does God only have to speak to Einsteins? Why can't he give a prophecy to someone who has a 70 IQ? Yeah, he can.
He said wise. Wise doesn't necessarily have to be defined by high academics.
I understand. I'm just giving. But the fact of the matter is that you're presenting a certain perspective. The point is that religion usually, in many ways, gives a totally opposite idea. When you look in terms of Judaism, which really called upon human beings to try and figure out as much as they can on their own and come up with conclusions. And even their perception of revelation, it's an interesting aspect of revelation because the revelation is not so finite in the sense that you have people arguing about revelation. So Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued, what about God? What did God really say? And the fact is that it's expected to be because God, when He presented it in such a way that called upon human beings to still use their heads. So what happens is that you're right. The point is that by postulating, by saying that, Richard, do you have to?
Hold on, I just have to.
Okay. By postulating that the events happened, you're actually redefining reality. Okay? It's not a myth, okay, from an Orthodox Jewish perspective, because this is part of reality. Part of reality is the dynamic nature, and even in our world today, where miracles are not obvious, the belief that of God is a God that still is above nature. And therefore, the other aspect of what you're saying in terms of Yetzias Mitzrayim is that we are still going through that process of figuring out how to be free people within this understanding of reality, finding our place in that understanding of reality, finding how we can make a difference in this reality, given the fact that the reality is really ultimately totally in God's hands.
But yet there's families that we've all experienced, which I find perplexing.
Have what?
There's families that we've all know,
Yeah.
all of us, who would deny the existence of God based on the Holocaust, and we're not going there.
Yeah.
But yet, at the Seder,
Yes.
which
You're now dealing with an issue of Jewish identity. The fact is why people. That's a totally different question.
That's another.
Why people
Keep some traditions and
maintain their Jewish identity okay, strongly maintain their Jewish identity, even as they don't believe in God, is an interesting phenomenon from a Jewish perspective. But the fact is there's
It's not
different.
Miraculous.
What?
It's an age-old problem.
It,
You didn't even talk about
right, and the fact is that it's an age-old problem, but there's also the fact that why we identify with Jewish identity. I mean, what's his name? Ha'am, who was the major philosopher of the Haskalah movement of secular Zionism. He was asked, why are you Jewish? He says, do you ask me why am I my mother's son? It was like, that's the way I am. That's who I am. That's just who I am. The fact is that there are people who state that they're atheists, and at the same point in time, they are almost fully observant of halacha. And to me, why? Because somehow their Jewish identity is extremely important to them. Now, Hasidus, Chabad tries to say this is an indication of their pintel yid, and that their soul, even though they don't consciously accept it, but their soul is saying they're a pintel yid. Okay, that's how a Chassid would answer the question. The point is, though, is that there's some reason for Jewish identity that exists. I mean, I can look at it other ways, in terms of, let's say, national identity. People willing to die for their country. Why are people willing to die for their country when it has for no defined reason? They have remarkable patriotism. Okay? And even more so. And you can take it down to the people that are willing to have fights over their soccer teams. Anyways, okay.
When they discover, like you said, where are the ruins? Where are the ancient kitchens? There's no archaeological findings.
Yeah,
However, that said, not long ago, they've just found, and they're excavating some sites where they think they have found the chariots that were swallowed up by the Sea of Reeds. So they are working on getting the archaeological
Yes.
facts.
The fact is that it's still a process. The truth is I'm not trying to say that the questions are all answered. The point is that you would, if the chariots did drown in the sea, you would expect to find chariots. The absence of documentation to support the Exodus is still a question.
Just meaning we haven't found it yet.
Yeah, we have. But my point is something different. What I'm trying to point out I'm trying to point out that what you have to recognize of what you're arguing for is something that is somewhat different than what we expect, because you're arguing about events or things that didn't happen as we would see them normally. But the point is, though, is that it's still significant that you believe that these or that there's an acceptance of the. You see, let me try and deal with this. What I'm saying is I'm presenting the idea that this is what Orthodox Judaism argues.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
By definition,
yeah,
within Orthodoxy, in my mind, tell me if I'm wrong, it's not relevant whether they find archaeological evidence or not.
Not necessarily so.
No, because I say, by definition, by believing in something as incomprehensible as God, you're accepting these conditions occurred.
Okay, so let me.
Okay, therefore, whether they find 50 chariots, 2 chariots, or 500.
Okay, so let me
Does validate my thinking.
Let me present the way I would approach it. If I was talking to someone, just let's say, if I was involved in a debate to prove my religion, right? Without archaeological evidence and so on and so forth, the person says, give me some arguments, I'm sort of like, I don't necessarily have arguments. Why I accept the conclusions of orthodoxy is much more of a personal reason why I accept them, and they don't necessarily, that does not necessarily mean I have arguments for others. In many ways, I find people who present arguments for others, or simple arguments for others, I usually find those arguments to be somewhat weak, and actually do a disservice to the full complexity of the religion by presenting those arguments. To me, it's not easy to prove A, B, C, D. The fact is, though, at the same point in time, that doesn't mean that a person who does not accept my conclusions, my belief, is in any way going to hell or something like that. I don't have, to me, God as judge has his own methodology. So if someone doesn't believe in orthodoxy, that doesn't mean he's going to hell from my perspective. Okay, God has his own evaluation of how he determines someone's life and so forth, and I don't even think about that, and I accept in terms of myself. I have to meet my own challenge and so forth and so forth. Obviously, I like it when people share my conclusions. I like the strength and so forth and so forth, and it's, but the fact is that I'm very adamantly not judgmental of another person. What I am interested, though, in is a clear understanding of what it is that you actually argue or believe in, and so forth. This is what Orthodox Judaism believes in. Does the absence of archaeological proof, is that an argument against it, though? In other words, if you sit there and say to me, okay, what about an argument against it? Doesn't this seem to imply that this did not occur? Okay, the point is...
What about Harley saying that it's unnecessary, that you understand?
No, the fact is that's what I'm trying to say. The point is, though, is that as we discover those things, we may get more information.
Absolutely.
And therefore...
But it doesn't change underlying...
No, the fact is that these, if you do find the chariots, that would be further support, but you have to understand that it's further support of what? It's further support of an event that really is problematic to us. See,
Doesn't Harley's statement cover that? Like, wouldn't Harley's
it would, but the truth is, I wouldn't say it's irrelevant. I wouldn't say it's irrelevant.
I don't mean the word irrelevant in terms of,
We accept
over
it
time,
without the...
but we accept it.
The fact is that...
The theology of orthodoxy is we accept it.
Right.
Okay.
We accept these conclusions.
When there's further evidence,
right,
that's nice.
Right, exactly.
But if there's no further evidence, it doesn't change
right, exactly.
our theology.
Exactly. That's it.
But what I was trying to say is if they do start making these discoveries,
yeah.
and what if we find out there are discoveries of such, but it doesn't quite prove what we've been
okay,
believing
so
all along.
something interesting?
It doesn't matter.
I'm going to tell you something. Do you remember when they used to have they had the whole Bible codes thing?
Yeah.
Okay? And they tried to show how the Torah must have been a divine book because it had all these codes. If you take the fifth letter down. Okay. The whole theory was basically blown apart. Okay, when the whole thing came out in book form and people were getting excited by it, basically statisticians came about and said, okay, this is ridiculous. Okay, now one of the people who came out and said it was ridiculous was actually an Orthodox scholar, a professor at Harvard, who I believe was also a Rav. And he was very adamant about this because he understood what the problem was with the argument, as an argument. One early article I read of someone who was very upset about the Bible codes was a guy who said, you know something, if this argument starts having validity, then I have to say this argument is a good argument. Then what happens if it starts proving something which I find to be wrong? That's exactly the point. And lo and behold, guess who came up with Bible codes soon after the Bible codes came up? A bunch of Christians. Fundamentalists found in Isaiah 53 a whole bunch of sources for whatever their belief was of Isaiah 53. The truth is if you're gonna live by the sword, you better die by the sword. So if you're going to come up with arguments that here is a classical proof, now the point is I happen to know a situation like that where there was an individual who became through some arguments, some very strong arguments of Torah, the proof of God, the proof of Torah, and so forth and so forth. And then supposedly he never looked at any biblical criticism because everyone told him how stupid it was and so forth and so forth because he had the proof. He had proofs of Torah and proof of God clearly and so forth and so forth. He unfortunately was going for a PhD in Talmud, and people were saying to him, you know something, you have to take a biblical criticism course. I can get a PhD in Talmud, a biblical criticism course. So he decided, you know something, I'm going to do a summer biblical criticism course, and I'll take, because to be, you know, say his obligation. He dropped everything a month into the biblical criticism course. The truth is, I told him, I wasn't surprised. I said, you were so adamant one way, you know, so on and so forth. When you were showed about how ridiculous you really were, and how these arguments have their basis, you know something. Maybe you shouldn't have been told about how wise you were in following the arguments you had for orthodoxy when you really didn't know what you were talking about.
Yeah,
okay?
the orthodoxy that was promoting, very significantly promoting
the Bible code. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. There were Orthodox institutions. Yeah, that's why I always found that I understand. Let's not. You're right. But the fact is I understand. And the fact is that's why I think one of the greatest kindnesses that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us was that one of the major advocates against the Bible codes, one of the people who was a critic, was himself an Orthodox scholar, so he was able to say, this has nothing to do with Orthodoxy. Sure. In other words, I'm telling you, as an Orthodox rabbi, this is ridiculous. So therefore, we can walk away and say, hey, listen, you can maintain your faith in the face of this thing. But the truth of the matter is that when people start throwing out arguments that sound so powerful and they really don't know what they're talking about, right? And that happens to me a lot of times. The truth is I've had a lot of trouble when I hear someone making a statement as if I've got the truth, and so forth and so forth. I know, and the fact is, the person really, unfortunately, doesn't know what they're talking about, and I basically feel somewhat of an obligation to basically pull the rug from underneath them because they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, the fact is that, listen, there's a lot of reasons for these arguments and so forth and so forth. The point is that it's important to recognize at the same point in time of that the arguments don't necessarily prove. The whole argument is a bit of biblical criticism does not necessarily prove the lack of revelation, because one of the things about God is the fact that you're talking about the anything's possible. So the point is you can't not. I mean, the arguments about belief in God, or say about this, the fact of the matter is with God, it's just okay. So, he's not doing it your way. I mean, whatever. You know, yeah.
Okay. Different, simplistic but complicated question. Let's go back to the Makot.
Yeah.
And you have Pshat and you have Midrash about them.
Yeah.
So what you were saying before in calling them miraculous, well, the miraculous pertains to more like 4 of the Makot. In other words, the third in the series and then the last. Okay, the reason being that the first 2 were replicable by the artists and magicians in Egypt.
Yeah, they're replicable.
Okay, whether they were the same, I don't know, but the situation was replicable.
Okay, so they were
wait.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's an interesting couple of phenomena going on right now. We had a solar eclipse, and we're about to have a lunar eclipse, coinciding 2 weeks away from each other, interestingly enough, and the lunar eclipse being very close to the timing of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now, given that the Egyptians worshipped the sun as a god,
Yeah.
and the moon, etc., this would be a believable natural phenomenon to occur. It wouldn't explain total darkness where Pshat, says can't see each other, face to face.
I'm not okay. Let me try and
wade through it.
No, what I'm saying is this. When you talk about what was able to be done, okay, all I'm contending is you're talking a different reality. That's my first point, okay? They did their things through magic, okay? Moshe changed his stick into a snake. They were able to do the same thing. Hey, you're not talking about our modern day magicians. You're talking about something different. And the fact is that's where you're talking about a reality which I can't comprehend. You know what I mean? I mean, the fact is that we don't have that kind of magic today. So my first point is that you're talking about a reality which is that. Now, the fact is the way God chose to show where he was coming from was he decided to play with them. In other words, okay, let's do something miraculous. Oh, you did it as well. Now I too. By 3, it was like, you can't do this anymore. But then the issue comes up where maybe Moshe's just a better miracle worker. Maybe he can do more magic. He's made a magician. The point is that I always say it. When Yul Brynner, okay, in the 10 Commandments, drops back into his throat and says, "He is God." That to me, and you know that I always tell people this. The 10 Commandments. It says over there, one of the thank yous of the 10 Commandments, is the Jewish Medrash, right? So the fact that Midrashim say Paro went home and said, he is God. So that's where they got Yul Brynner saying that. But the point is that to me, it was very significant that it started out, first of all, my point is you're dealing with reality which is not our reality. So therefore, whether it's miracles or stuff like that, you're dealing with something else. You're dealing with things which and we run into it every once in a while. We look at Stonehenge and say, how do they do that? I have no idea. But the fact is that I don't know.
Up against incomprehensible all the time.
Okay, so the point is that I don't know. But the fact is that it's important to understand Yetziat Mitzrayim from a classical Jewish perspective, that it occurred within a definition of reality which we don't have, ultimately pointing to the reality of a God that is above the rules of nature, which means that different rule. And that yields a completely different understanding of what happens. And that Yetziat Mitzrayim was the movement from that point in time. And in many ways, what we're asked upon to experience at the Seder night is some type of recognition of that movement, which to me is part of the dynamic nature of existence. Because the fact is to me, Judaism's function, or Judaism's dynamics, is, and I find this to be remarkable as a religion, is the attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible, the attempt to deal with the movement of the human being within God's world. And let me go back to if you go back to Jewish philosophy, everyone asks, one of the great incomprehensibilities of God is that He knows everything, He controls everything, and yet there's free choice. The fact is that's presented in the Das Tfunos by Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. The Ramchal talks about this in Das Tfunot, and he points out that that what Chesed ultimately is the direct hand of God in existence. As God is totally good, therefore He basically wants to do good, and therefore Chesed is ultimately God in charge of everything in the world. Free choice challenges that. And he says Din is basically the realm of free choice because it's based upon judgment, and it says that human beings will take some control of the world. Okay, so the fact is that in terms of judgment, in terms of human being takes control of the world. So the point is, did I get here by my own action of driving a car, where I had free choice in driving the car, or did God direct me in driving the car? The fact is that ultimately the Das Tfunos says, and Michal basically says it's both. Okay, that somehow you have free choice, and basically God controls your actions. And
that's make sure there were no obstacles in your way.
Well, no, not even that. Not even that. The fact is that it's incomprehensible, and that is incomprehensible. Okay, yeah.
How do you know if it's dealing with lots of incomprehensible things? How do you quote unquote know that you understand what's happening?
You don't.
Or they know.
The fact is, the most you can do is say, "This is the best I can figure out."
So we're supposed to assume that the Jews in Mitzrayim who were going through it were saying that also.
The fact is that in many ways, it's very interesting that when you read certain statements made by Gedolim when they're writing a thing, their opening words, "Lefi ani asdaiti," according to the poverty of my mind. The fact of the matter is that you basically, this is again a paradoxical or dialectic aspect of Judaism. You're called upon to make decisions, and you're called upon to stand by your decisions. You're also called upon to recognize that your decision you may be weak in your decision. The fact is that in many ways we're called upon to do that. I think it was Robert Frost who said that the courage is making decisions with insufficient facts. The fact of the matter is that's the human experience. And the point is that's what we are called upon to do.
You can never know enough.
Yeah.
You're talking about the Bible codes and so on. The argument they give, the Kuzari argument through national revelation and so on.
But
for the existence of Orthodox, for the
argument of Kuzari, the argument of Kuzari is 600,000 saw it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the fact is that the argument of Kuzari, it's an interesting argument. The fact of the matter is that the argument as a proof to someone who doesn't believe, what the Kuzari's argument was, is specifically in the realm of religion. It's very interesting if you really look at the context of the Kuzari's argument. The Muslim, the Christian guy came, and basically what happened is he basically said, belief in Jesus is a leap of faith, and basically the one thing that he agreed upon was what happened to the Jews in the Bible. And then the Muslim scholar came and said, Muhammad got this revelation. There was also a certain aspect of what we call a leap of faith. There was no proof. But on the same point in time, why did the Muslim accept what happened to the Jewish people in the desert? Because everyone knows it, because it's written down. And these events were written down in front of multitudes. So the Kuzari basically then says, let me get this straight. Not everyone believes in Christianity, not everyone believes in Islam. But both Christianity and Islam believe in what the Jews say happened, because they both say, well, it was written down and it said it happened in front of 100,000 people, 600,000 people, and therefore we all believe it. So the truth of the matter is that he was really arguing from religious perspective, that all these religions, they themselves said they believed in what happened to the Jews, but they disagreed in the other stuff because there wasn't something that happened in terms of a populace. That argument of 600,000 is dependent for today on the documentation. If you don't believe in the documentation being true, okay, and the point is the argument of historians is that the documentation was falsified. And they have arguments over 1,000 years. The story that may have begun with 6 people saying became 600,000 people saying. The truth is, I obviously don't agree with that argument, but the point is that you have to understand what the argument is. It's one thing to argue that you can't go up to a bunch of, like everyone says, you can't go up to a bunch of people today and say, your parents saw or saw this event if it didn't really happen. That's true. But if you really argue, if you really look at what history arguments, it doesn't say you walked up to your parents. It basically says that over 1,000 years, these documents somehow became accepted within this society, where there were people in this society who basically had some reason to accept those documents. So that's a completely different argument. Listen, I'm not trying to... the fact is to me, I'm not trying to destroy all these arguments, especially the arguments that support my own viewpoint. And in certain ways, I buy those arguments. I think my arguments are a little bit more, have a little bit more reason for acceptance. Basically, has a lot to do with the fact that I believe that the Jewish realm, the Jewish world, was always were critical thinkers. See, one of the significant arguments against is the fact that the belief in the ancient world is there weren't critical thinkers except the Greeks. The fact is, I believe that the Jews were critical thinkers, and therefore it would be hard. That's why to me, I have an issue of not really fully understanding how the Sadducees and Pharisees came about. I know that historians say the Sadducees were beforehand, and then the Pharisees developed. I have a real difficulty with that, because the Pharisees were critical thinkers, and they wouldn't start believing in a Torah Shabbal Peh as critical thinkers unless they had reason to believe in it. On the other hand, the arguments that are presented on how the Sadducees came about, which was basically some statements found in some sources. The fact is to me, I think that's pretty incomplete, because if there was a Torah Shabbal Peh, how could people just totally reject it? And the fact is therefore, to me, I don't really know how the Sadducee-Pharisee thing really came about, but to me, the real issue is because I believe that Jews were critical thinkers, and that was part of their makeup. They were always critical thinkers. So that changes the nature of my understanding and why they were different than other populaces at the time. So the fact that world over there, or that nation over there, could buy some myths and so forth was not an argument within the Jewish world, because to me, I really perceive that the Jewish realm to have been very involved in critical thinking. Okay, so that, anyways, but the point is is I guess what it comes down to is I do think the significance of Jesus was trying to understand what you're really believing. You're believing in a different reality, and that God somehow took us out in a miraculous way from Egypt, reinforcing this different reality, and that the freedom in many ways that we then went through was the challenge that really was the challenge of history of developing our own place, which then works within the more normative reality, because that's the world of logic where we really start thinking and so forth, but with the recognition of the miraculous nature of God. And if I would look at how we experience the Seas Mitzrayim today, it's in that dialectic of understanding that we are called upon to move forward and be thinkers and free people within our world today, given the fact, though, that we also accept the fact that there is the realm of the incomprehensible, is the realm of God. Okay?
Thank you very
Any
much.
further point? Okay. Thank you.